I'm Thomas Arthur Lymbery. I've lived all my life in Grey Creek, British Columbia. I'm going to start with my dad coming here to Grey Creek in 1911. He was a lawyer in Nottingham, England. He didn't like the law, and he liked the country, and he was very interested in trees. And at that time, there was a great promotion to bring people to Canada to grow fruit all over. In fact, it was included all sorts of areas like Invermere, which could only grow poor apples and things. So, but it was partly a real estate promotion. But he and another man traveled across the Okanagan and investigated different areas. They didn't like the Okanagan, and because it was too dry, there weren't enough trees. And he was given good advice. Look for a place with a lot of water. So what he found in Grey Creek was a place with 2 creeks and a spring, Crowsdale, Oliver Creek, and not too far from Grey Creek if they needed more water yet. So he decided to buy 100 acres here, which he paid $100 an acre. And he and a partner spent the first winter looking after the Crowsdale house. Now, Henry Crowsdale, we came up with as a possible father of Grey Creek because he bought 200 acres here, started planting apple trees, brought in people to work, and in 1908, the first post office was established here with Tom Oliver Sr. as the postmaster. So Dad happened to live next to, there was no dock the first year he came. Moye used to come in, and the advantage of the sternwheelers was that they could land on any beach, put a sloping plank down, and unload supplies and people. So that's how when his partner first came. In 1912, the next year, the government built a floating wharf. Because Kootenay Lake is navigable water, all the docks were built by the federal government. In 1931, Nasukin started running 3 days a week from Grey Creek to Fraser's Landing, which is a mile further towards Nelson than existing Balfour Landing. They had just completed the road between Grey Creek and Kuskook, and they had to do this because I don't know whether you've read any of Michael Cohn's new book about 100 years of Kootenay Lake ferries. But back in 1921, the Canadian Pacific Railway was running a daily sternwheeler service from Nelson to Kootenay Landing, which was as far as the track that came through the Crow's Nest Pass. That was as far as it came. And so this daily boat was serving the south end. But in 1929, the CPR started filling in that 30 miles of missing track. And the provincial government knew that if they didn't get a road built down our side, there wouldn't be a road across BC, because up until that time, from 1921 to 1930, the Nasukin or the Moye, whichever of the big sternwheelers was running the daily trip to Kootenay Landing, would carry cars and unload them at Kuskook. And so this was an important road, so they let out a contract to a Vancouver contracting company to build some of the road from Kuskook to Geno's Landing, which was about where the glass house is today. And then they completed the rest of the road by day labor. It wasn't this was 1930, 29, 30, 31. So this wasn't a relief camp. They did start relief camps in the Great Depression. A relief camp was when we had so many unemployed people because there were no jobs when this Great Depression happened. No jobs for anybody. So the federal government finally set up these relief camps where they provided accommodation and food and some basic clothing to people who didn't have any, paid them 20 cents a day, which only paid for the tobacco. That was a big, if it had been $1 a day, it wouldn't have been a problem. But 20 cents didn't amount to much. But in any case, back to the road to Kuskook, the rest of it was built by what they called day labor. So they got up to $4 a day. And we have a beautiful series, our Historical Society has a beautiful series of pictures which may appear in Lost Kootenays or other books of that type. My dad also worked on that road, but he wasn't walking like Colin Haddon. He would milk his cow, then row his boat to wherever the project was, and put in 9 hours for $3 a day, and then row back and milk the cow again. So I knew a lot of, there's one picture with all of the men that worked on this. The major problem was a big rock that became known as Burden's Rock because Oscar Burden from Kootenay Bay was the foreman in charge. And they had about 15 men and a team of horses. They spent a whole winter blasting their way with hand steel. They didn't have any air compressor, so a hand steel is a question of one man holds a drill, another man hammers it, and he rotates it a quarter turn every time between strokes. And they would drill holes and you set a stick of dynamite in this, and that took them, as they say, a whole winter, and they finally got through that. And there was a daily mail service. A man called Tony Kunst had a Model A pickup, and he would pick up on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. He'd pick up the mail that came off the daily Greyhound and take it to Crawford Bay, Port Crawford, and Kootenay Bay post offices and bring the empty bags back. In 1913, because Dad was living closest to the Grey Creek dock, where the Moye or some of the other boats, Kuskook, came in and landed and brought the mail and supplies 3 days a week. 3 of the community men each put up $200 each to get Dad to build a little store, and that's what he did. And here's the store in 1915. And Tom Oliver Sr., who had the post office from 1908, said to Dad, well, you might as well take over the post office as well because it's only worth $25 a year. So that's how the store came into being. As soon as the road was completed, or while the road was completing in 1929-30, my dad realized that they needed to be closer to where the traffic was waiting for the ferry. So he got the little old store, put on rollers, and pulled it along the road with a stump puller. The first day, Mother had $1 to put away. But by April of 1931, they started the Nisukin running a daily service landing right at our store. So we grew up with the Nisukin on the doorstep, and every day that would carry a bus on the way from Nelson to Calgary. So we had the Greyhound on our doorstep. And then, of course, from there on, we would be, my sister and I would be given the job of running the phone messages to the Greyhound drivers. So we would be running down to the dock to tell them that they had to call 800 Nelson, which was the Nelson distribution. Now, Greyhound in Canada started in 1929 when a man purchased an existing bus line that John Learmonth had started in 1922. So the buses that were coming daily off the Nisukin stopped at Kingsgate, Kingsgate, and at that point they interchanged with US buses, so somebody could leave from anywhere in the Kootenays and travel to Spokane or California. Everybody dressed up in those days to travel. So, and the Greyhound drivers were so friendly and so helpful too. And I organized a last trip from Nelson to Grand Forks and back again. It wasn't quite the last day because there was a bus a later day, but it wouldn't have got us. There would have been no way of getting back from Grand Forks anymore. So that was a sad day when that disappeared, and it left a lot of people in rural communities without any service. My mother was a twin, and she and her twin became school teachers, which she didn't particularly like. When the First World War came along, she joined something called the Women's Land Army, where they went to work on farms and fill in for the men who were called up to go to France. So she went to some training where, among other things, they taught them how to milk using a rubber udder. But she made a great friend on this job when they did start working on the farm, driving the teams of horses, spreading manure or hauling turnips and things like that. And because first of all, the men said the women couldn't do this, but they proved they could. So she made a great friend who was Anne Gooch, who was married to a Major Gooch, who had gone back to England to join up to his regiment. And she went as well and joined this land army. And she was always talking about Crawford Bay. And after the war in 1918 or 19, she talked Mother into making a trip to Canada and stayed over the winter with her. And the Crawford Bay Women's Institute was putting on a play of some sort that Mother was acting. They'd signed Mother up to act into. And Dad went to see the play, and that's where they met. And then she wasn't sure about moving to this wild country and marrying a man that was 15 or more years older than she was. And so she went back to England for a year, and then when she did that, she went to the Salisbury School of Art. But at any rate, she decided in coming, and so they got married. They were the second couple to be married into the Harrison Memorial Church in 1921. And my sister was born in 1926, and Mother had a premature and another child that didn't survive. And because of this, when I was expected, my mother was sent to Kaslo 30 days before I was born. So I was born in the Kaslo Hospital, the Kaslo Victorian Hospital in 1928. So traveled there and back on, that was my first trip on the Moye when I was perhaps 10 days old. In 1929, all the U.S. Banks and everything. Now, Canada has a big difference between the U.S. In the U.S., states regulate the banks. And in some states, it's no more complicated to open a bank than it is to open a general store. So many of these banks went bankrupt almost immediately as soon as the Depression started and funds became tighter. And then this depression spread all across the world. It took a while to get to Europe, but it did affect things all over the world, but also in Canada. And unfortunately, in the 1930s, Saskatchewan had a bunch of dust storms when you couldn't grow anything. And when we say dusted and busted, they were broke. They just abandoned their houses, just walked out with whatever they could take with a $50 car, and they kept going west, knowing that if they got into BC, they could at least grow vegetables and survive. Because we lived underneath the store, if we heard footsteps upstairs, and the old store had a lobby, and this came from the little building that they moved, and we'd hear somebody open the door, and we knew that somebody was looking for the store or coming for their mail perhaps. So we would run up and open the door, unlock the door, let them into the body of the store. And as soon as my sister Alice and I were 12 years old, we started work in the store, and so did our kids did the same thing. I started putting the price on things, but before that, we had an exercise book, which was supposedly a price book, but it wasn't always up to date, so somebody would be forever calling down to the dining room table or wherever who was under knew what's the price of potatoes and things like this. The school had to have 8 students. So our Great Creek Hall was built in 1911-12 in order to, because there were at least 8 students at that time. So they finally got the first teacher in 1914. So, and I started school when I was 6 years old in 1934. Teachers were paid about $50 a month in those years, and they would spend 25 of that to board somewhere. And then I finally got through grade 8 in 1942. Other boys being sent from here and from isolated places to boarding schools in Vancouver. So he sent me off on the Greyhound in September 1942 to go to school at North Shore College in North Vancouver. And boarding schools, you got to know the boarders much more than the day boys. And of course, wartime rationing came in soon, so we ate a lot of liver, and we had horse meat, and that was fine, and then some whale, but whale was kind of fishy and coarse, so we weren't too happy with that. And then in 1952, we got power for the first time. They built the longest power line in the world across Kootenay Lake to supply power to Riandel. The Riandel mine was reopening because in the Korean War, the price of lead went up substantially, and the price of metal is what moves things in the mining business. but they also needed power in Kimberley, so they built the power line to Kimberley, and that created the first road over the hill. And of course, down the pass was a very basic four-wheel drive road, so it could only be used by four-wheel drives, which were expensive and hard to operate in those years. And people were forever pressing. We had an organization called Rose or Gray. There's got to be a way. We had a social credit member who promised us to get the pass built if we elected him. And we did. And he did get it built. But it had to be passable with any standard vehicle and built to the forestry requirements for a major haul road. So it's been operating since 1990. In 1990, we had an official opening day with the Minister of Forests, Claude Richmond, came to open that. And they had 5 buses, 2 or 3 buses coming from this side, and 2 because there was very little parking at the summit. So they took us up by buses instead of having clusters of cars. In our store, the old store, we always had a surplus of bread. And bread would come from Caslow or from Nelson and later on from Creston. But the minimum order was, I think, 20 loaves, and we didn't always sell that many in a week, so they would be getting a little dry, and we always ended up feeding them to the chickens. In order to get milk for the store, my dad always had a cow. That was the supply. And so we sometimes, because cows don't milk all year, they have some weeks off before the next calf arrives. So we would often have 2 cows. So looking after those took a lot of time because they had to be milked twice a day. And then the milk, if we weren't selling it in the summertime, of course we didn't have enough, but still people would order, we'd have regular customers. And we would fill this into these big solid milk bottles that used a paper cap that you pressed in. One of the problems was that the milk sold for 10 cents a quart, but the bottles were worth 25 cents, so we had to try and collect a deposit of 25 cents. As I was starting to say before, the old store got to the point where in the summertime, because it was so small, you could only get about 5 customers in at a time. And we would have people lined up on the road outside waiting to get in the summer. So I knew that we had to have a bigger store if we're going to stay in the business. So Jerry Abel from Boswell, his family had moved from Germany and bought a place in Boswell, and he'd got involved in building his dad's house, so he discovered that was something he enjoyed, and we hadn't really, first of all, we knew we needed a full basement, so we started digging that first of all. Got this put in and started on the basement in 1977, I think, and that the next March, Sharon and I got the first trip to Hawaii. But in any case, Jerry was interested in building for us, and so he and I worked on a design, and we decided to put it closer to the lake. We had to have space for parking in front of it, so we got Jerry busy building, and he came up with a timber frame system. But today we have 12 people working in our store. And now we have 2 or 3 specialized wood stove salesmen, because that's one of the most important parts of our business. Sharon was the third in. She had an older brother and an older sister, but for some reason she was the one who always got sent to the store for the groceries. So we met over the counter. So at any rate, I asked Sharon if she would go to the dance at Windle sometime, which was... So she did, and I took her to the Windle dance, and then I wanted to get a hamburger afterwards, and so it was about 3:30, 4 o'clock before I got her home, and her parents were horrified because her older sister had to get married before, and that was something that happened in those years. So Sharon was forbidden to see me again. But Billy and Sylvia James, he was a man that worked at the mine, and they had a house in Grey Creek, and they used to employ Sharon as a babysitter, and to be helpful if they was picking up Sharon, they would honk as they went by, so I knew I could go and visit while she was babysitting. So she knew all the time that she was afraid that I was going to come up with a ring for her, so she knew it was going to happen one of these days. But while she was in Vancouver, she finally accepted a ring from me. So at that point when she accepted the ring, I came home. I was very happy, and I inadvertently mentioned to somebody in the insurance office that I was engaged and possibly getting married next April. Sharon hadn't written home quick enough, but so that hadn't gone back to June, her mother, too quickly. So at any rate, we were finally married at Crawford Bay Harrison Memorial, and had a reception at the Grey Creek Hall in April of 1963. It's got lots of... this is the largest ice-free lake in Canada, for one thing. And the only problem is, of course, is the ferry isolates out, but that, in a way, is also an asset as well. For one thing, we get longer daylight. If you look across the Caslow, they're in shade by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We are not. Tremendous difference in variety of shoreline, and there's also it's a relatively light population spread over a big area, so that's an asset in itself. And of course, things like Kootenay Springs have improved the district enormously. And its services have improved since Johnny Stalker and his sons built the Crawford Bay Market. And things have grown. It's easier to find employment now than it used to be, other than, of course, when the mine was open, that was a different operation again. Well, I call it the best shore.